Welcome to the fourth episode of the Regs. I'm hopped up on a lot of coffee, so I'm ready to get down to it. Continuing our um, life histories of all the salmon, as well as various other fish and fishes. I have got this podcast on Spotify, so you can now listen to it on the go, which is really awesome. And just trying to make it easier for you guys to get some fish education in your think skulls. So, we only have two species left in the species of Alaska salmon that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about one I work with a lot, which is sockeye or red salmon. And to know a few things about sockeye salmon, they are the most commercially valuable salmon in the state. They also have one of the arguably highest meat qualities of all the salmon, and they are one of the longest lived salmon species. And they also have an incredibly narrow diet, whereas a lot of the other salmon species don't. So, let's get down to it. So, the first and foremost thing you have to know about red salmon is that they can only exist in drainages that have lakes attached to them. So, they may spawn in flowing waters like creeks and rivers still. However, those creeks and rivers must have a lake where their juveniles can rear in. And that's just because of the feeding habits that they have in their specific rearing requirements that sockeye need to grow and eventually leave to the ocean. So, back to our hypothetical salmon in the Kenai drainage. All right. So, our red salmon has returned from the ocean. It is now looking for the area in which it spawned in. Now, sockeye can get down to within feet of where they were actually born, which is one of the most incredible things that salmon can do because they take an imprint of where they were born on a molecular level. That voice crack, though. So they get really close to where they were born. And sockeye salmon stray the least of all the salmon. They still do, but just not a lot. So our sockeye has gone and spawned their eggs in the substrate, and now it's incubating. It's collecting CTUs and thermal units just like all the others. And now our hypothetical salmon is hatched into an alvin, and it's digging into the substrate where it can live, continue to grow, and develop. And then once it turns into a fry and it's absorbed its yolk sac, it will rise into the stream, into the water column, or into the lake where it was hatched. And then it now looks for a lake to live in. And so when it moves up into the lake, in sockeye salmon, because of the way they live in lakes, they tend to have the biggest impact in terms of predator feeding habits when it comes to salmon smolt. So this is why in some lakes, lake trout that have access to salmon smolt, particularly sockeye smolt, will feed pelagically like they are normally found to and live in deep water because their food is pelagic and living in deep water. Whereas in most of the state, lake trout are a shallow water species because a lot of their food stays shallow instead of out deep. We just don't have a lot of pelagic dwelling freshwater species in the state except lake trout and sockeye salmon. So lake trout tend to stay shallow because of this, unless there is sockeye salmon present or some kind of salmon presence in the lake. They just follow the food, but if they can, they will stay in deep water where they tend to like it. But we're getting off track. The point is, by describing that, sockeye salmon smolt have the biggest impact on how freshwater predator species tend to feed in terms of other fin fishes, like char and lake trout. So it's moved up into its respective lake, into the Kenai Lake or even the Upper Russian Lake. So it's now living, swimming, it's schooling up, and it's feeding on planktonic animals like zygotes, the family members of the copepodic family, and even Daphnia, which Daphnia are the most important to sockeye salmon, first to copepods, and zygotes are second to copepods. But they need this diversity in planktonic food sources to grow and live. And so these guys will spend 2 years in fresh water typically, unless they decide to stay, which does happen, and eventually become kokanee, which kokanee are specifically sockeye salmon that have stayed in fresh water longer than 2 years. So they could still go out to the ocean, but it's very unlikely that they won't go to the ocean eventually, is what I'm saying. But once they've stayed in fresh water past 2 years, they're pretty much a kokanee. They're not landlocked. They just chose to stay in fresh water. So our sockeye salmon continuously feed on planktonic animals the most, living in the deeper parts of the lake, usually along the thermocline where the warm and cold water layers meet. And they do start to feed on terrestrial animals, so insects and things like that, eventually, and invertebrates, but still not to the degree they're feeding on planktonic animals. So eventually, in the springtime, like with the rest of the salmon species, when water's high from snow melt and there's storms because of the changing seasons, they move to saltwater. And they do this over, the springtime period when the snow is melting, and all the while they're getting fed on by rainbow trout, lake trout, char. Every predator that wants to get after them is getting after them at this point because they're staging up and they have to go through choke points to now move downstream where predators like to ambush them. And fun fact, of all the salmon smolt that rear in fresh water for long periods of time, sockeye salmon have almost no par marks. And par marks are these little bars that are on salmon when they're in fresh water, and they're just added camouflage, but they're almost a perfect pinkish chrome, their whole sides, to reflect the water around them, so they're almost invisible, and just good camouflage for pelagic fish is just being reflective in color. And so these salmon are now moving out to the ocean. Just like the rest of the other salmon species, their thyroid gland is kicking in, causing them to go through a metamorphosis of sorts, where they grow the cells to exchange salinity out of their bodies so they can live in the marine environment. And then their immune systems are kicking into overdrive. And now they are in the marine environment where they in their entire life, they almost only feed on planktonic animals and crustaceans, which is why reds, or sockeye salmon, get such a deep ruby red coloration in their meat, because they absorb so much of the chemical in crustaceans that when you boil them, they turn red. Same thing. Their bodies don't shed it, so they just get these really beautiful deep ruby red coloration in their flesh. Sockeye salmon don't, however, feed exclusively on crustaceans and planktonic animals. They do feed on small fishes and squid, but again, not to the degree that they feed on planktonic animals. However, even though they're classified or they are filter feeders for the most of their life in the marine environment, I do know somebody who actually occasionally picks them up trolling around in Kodiak, and that's just because they still will eat other things, but it's just more rare to catch them feeding on anything but krill and shrimp and whatnot. And so eventually, our sockeye salmon, just like with all the other salmon, has iron molecules in its brain that align with the magnetic north and south. It moves north back to its home stream. Through smell, it zeroes in on its home stream, finds with it, finds an area very close to where they were born. But this doesn't go for all reds, however. Some just go to the stream and spawn. Some get within feet of where they're born. And some may not even bother and just go to a different stream entirely. But this doesn't happen as commonly with reds as it does all the other salmon. So, and now it fights and grows and competes for mates, and the cycle continues, and it will live. Also, I did skip this. In the ocean, reds live 3 to 5 years. So they are one of the longest lived salmon species of all the salmon. All right. So now you have your basic life history of a red salmon. And all the salmon life histories are very similar. They all just have usually different points when it comes to how long they live in the ocean and just how long they live in freshwater. Those are normally the two biggest differences between salmon species. It's just those two things and what they feed on. But otherwise, they're all very similar. So, what I mainly wanted to talk about with reds is the hatchery setting for red salmon. Because they are the most commercially valuable. Hatcheries love to produce red salmon if they can, but they are arguably the most difficult of all the salmon to rear in hatchery facilities. And the big reason is because of a virus called IHN, which causes necrosis in red salmon. And it's so bad that by the time you even detect it in a raceway full of reds, it's pretty much too late, and they all die with the snap of a finger. So, and then at that point, because there was an outbreak, you have to get rid of all the dead fish. You have to bleach the raceway and start all over, because now those salmon, whether or not they survived, are a biohazard to all the other reds in the facility, and even king salmon, as well as chum salmon, because they're all susceptible to IHN, though they may not carry it. So reds typically have to be reared away from chums and kings in particular, because chums and kings can catch IHN, though they don't carry it like the red salmon do. So because of this, red salmon rearing is centered around making sure reds don't show signs or symptoms of IHN. So there is an entire manual, which is actually a really good read. I encourage you to find it. It's just the Alaska Sockeye Salmon Rearing Manual. Really easy read, really quick, and it talks about just the details around which you should raise and how to raise your sockeye salmon. Everything from an egg take to release. And so I'm giving you a very abridged version of it, or just talking about some points on it. So, sockeye salmon In a hatchery setting, they catch just about every disease that a salmon can that's ever been registered to a salmon. So they have to be watched a lot. There needs to be a lot of care and tools dedicated to a specific raceway of sockeye. So at a hatchery I've worked at, each raceway has its own set of tools and its own water, or not own water source. They all share a main water source, but it's divided off between the raceways. They all have oxygen divided off between the raceways. All raceways have barriers in between them. And in a lot of instances, the raceways will have coho salmon, which I talked about in the previous episode, as another means of distance between individual raceways of red salmon. And an interesting thing about reds, it's generally frowned upon to mess with them when they're in their incubation state, because the younger sockeye salmon is, whether it's an egg, alvin, fry, or smolt, sorry, at any point in its life, it can pretty much die from IHN, but as it gets older, the likelihood of it decreases. So I was told by one of my mentors in the hatchery scene that 90%, if not more, of IHN outbreaks happen when sockeye fry are in their fry stage. So that's when you need to care for them the most, and watch them the most. And you need to monitor the heck out of them. I mean, I know I just restated watching them the most, but with different words. But my point still stands. So, yeah, in every single instance that they are messed with or touched with, from egg pick, which is sorting all the dead eggs out from the good eggs, or even egg takes, we're disinfecting constantly ourselves, the fish, and the eggs, just to bring down as much risk of an IHN outbreak as possible. IHN sucks. I am happy to say I have never had to experience an IHN outbreak, but every single time I've got to talking about it, without fail, it is a very depressing topic of conversation for any person who works in the hatchery scene, because all the hard work up to the point has just been wasted, and all those fish are dead now, as well as the work you have to do to make sure everything is disinfected to high hell, and clean, so another outbreak doesn't happen, or the virus doesn't jump from one raceway to another. And what sucks even more about this virus is once fish show symptoms of it, they have this virus has a transmission in the fish world referred to as vertical and horizontal transmission in the water. So it has an incredibly high. It's basically like, for humans, it's the cold, which that virus. It's everybody gets it eventually, but they don't carry it. But the difference between the cold and IHN is the fact that all sockeye carry it, but they might not show the symptoms of it. So again, it's just centered around not stressing them out. And even at an egg take, the killers at an egg take, the people who snap the sockeye female necks to instead of whacking them so you don't shock the eggs or damage them possibly, those fish are disinfected by dipping them in a barrel of Ovidine, and then they're taken, put on a rack, then wiped off with the Ovidine and slime, wiped the ovidine and slime off. Sorry, I'm losing track of what I'm saying. And then once those fish, they're taken, they're cut open, and the eggs, just the eggs, if any blood gets into a bowl, then that bowl is pretty much tossed, and that's it. The fish's eggs just got wasted. So you have to be incredibly careful with removing the eggs from a sockeye salmon. And then more ovidine is after, sorry, skipping a step. And then once the eggs are in the bowl, you get about the circumference of a pinky nail's worth of sperm from 2 males. That's the ratio typically used for a lot of salmon species to maintain genetic diversity. 2 males per 3 females. And once you got the sperm in with the males, you mix water in. Take your finger, swirl it around, and make sure all the eggs get sperm into them. Because it's only about a 30-second period of time where the sperm has enough energy after it's been activated by touching water. By the way, the water that we use for that is also disinfected using a UV light. We fly out there and it's attached to a battery, so it's virus-free water. And then once transmission from the sperm to the egg has occurred, pour the water out, and then you pour ovidine in with the eggs. It doesn't hurt the eggs. It's just another level of insurance that the eggs don't spread around more IHN. And then you rinse them off with more IHN, or not IHN, ovidine. And at that point, there's not a whole lot more that's done with the eggs beyond stashing them in an incubator after they've been transported. And to make sure the eggs don't get stressed out too much, if the temperature is off by however many degrees, just like when you buy fish at the fish store, you don't want to stress them out by just dumping them in to water. You put the bag that the eggs are contained in directly into the incubator. You let them sit for X amount of time, depending on the temperature differential, and then you release the eggs into the incubator, and then they will sit and wait until egg pick. And when egg pick occurs, just about every instance that you move the eggs, sorting them with this machine from dead eggs to live eggs, you also disinfect them again. Every single step of the way, every single instance you can, disinfect, disinfect, disinfect when it comes to reds. Like, for instance, pink salmon, you don't care. You could literally drop them on the floor, scoop them back up, and put them right back into the incubator, no questions asked. We try not to do that, but the point still stands. And then it's just a matter of making sure the fish are happy and healthy and keeping them in an optimal environment so they don't express IHN. And then once you release them to the ocean, it's a lot of stress gone away right up until you get more fish, because they're freaking sockeye. Okay, now for the subsistence scene, sockeye are the most important commercially and subsistence wise, because there are comparable amounts of sockeye salmon to pink salmon. They are the second most populous of all the salmon. And they are the most valued commercially because of their high numbers and their meat quality, and just from the sheer fact that, everybody knows a sockeye salmon. It's the big red salmon with the green head, advertised and painted on just about everything. So they are great commercially. I don't have much to say on them beyond without sockeye salmon in today's commercial fishing scene, this state would crash very rapidly and lose a lot of money. So we have to protect them arguably the most out of all the salmon species, because without sockeye salmon, you just can't, you lose more than a fifth of all the commercial fishing resources in this state. So the problem with sockeye salmon, though, commercially, is the fact that because they're the most valuable, they're fished the most. So there's just a lot of competition between commercial fishermen, more than usual, because everybody wants a chunk of the change that sockeye salmon bring in. So there is everything from poaching to you just straight up illegal fishing, and even like people who fight each other off for the right to fish particular parts in the state. This happens mostly where, enforcement of fishing regulations is seldom, if at all, occurring, which is unfortunately most of the state. So sockeye salmon fortunately do very well in most areas. They don't have a ton of problems beyond, every occasion. Ever so occasionally there's a population crash, and it could be due to one or two things, typically overfishing or actually underfishing, believe it or not. Weird concept, huh? But we've reached this weird equilibrium because we've existed with commercial fishing in this state for sockeye for so long that what ends up happening is, if there are not enough predators in a given drainage, this is a big contributing factor. The sockeye salmon can actually overeat the planktonic contents in a lake, so that there's a giant die-off of most of the fish that escape out before they can escape out to the ocean, where there's, more food for them. And to give you an example, Carluck Lake had a serious problem where too many fish were in the system, and there was a overabundance of smolt feeding on plankton. The planktonic population crashed and caused poor returns for most salmon species in the drainage for a long time before the planktonic population finally recovered and is now feeding the fish. This doesn't normally happen. Okay, the only reason it really happens now is because human intervention is now far beyond to the point where we are actually part of the ecosystem for a lot of these places, because we help keep those planktonic crashes, to some degree anyways, from happening because of our commercial harvest or subsistence harvest or even sport harvest. But again, this wouldn't really be happening as much, or we wouldn't have to intervene if we never intervened in the first place. But that's just human beings for you. We like to take, and of course, again, Alaska is a take state. So our culture is a lot based around a lot of subsistence. So I will say commercial harvest as well as subsistence harvest of red salmon is very important for sockeye salmon populations and plankton populations in lakes and a lot of the state. Because if you destroy a planktonic population, it affects all the fish in freshwater in this state, because they all have to feed on planktonic animals at one point or another, whether it's a pike, a whitefish, a lake trout, a burbot, a grayling, even a stickleback. They all need plankton in lakes to live. So proper regulation for sockeye salmon in this state is one of the most necessary things as far as regulations for commercial harvest goes, we need to constantly monitor, watch and record so we can always have a better picture of sockeye salmon populations in this state and projections for what they're going to do in terms of returns and releases. It's very important. I cannot stress enough how much hatcheries help actually with sockeye salmon populations, because a lot of the hatcheries in this state are centered around providing fish so you don't have to take from wild stocks and cause population crashes by taking too much. It's a weird balance that you have to maintain. And so, like one hatchery in particular releases sockeye salmon at a remote site where they don't come back into fresh water. They are it's what's called a terminal fishery. Those fish are there just to be taken. Like Seward, for example, has a terminal sockeye salmon fishery. Those fish are put there just to be taken for people who are fishing subsistence so they can get what they need without taking away from wild stocks, which is why I'm a huge supporter of the hatchery scene in Alaska. And they even do this with silver salmon. But one place in particular does such a good job of this. They get about a 30% or more return, which is insane. Like a good return is 1%. That's what hatcheries shoot for. So when you get a return that's more than 1%, let alone 30% or more, it's insane. And it's a great return because it produces more money for the hatcheries so they can hopefully keep themselves funded and produce more fish so people have fish to eat and catch, sell, etc. They're great. It's a great program. And it does it without any risk of genetic, there's little to no risk. It's still there. It's always there. But there's little to no risk of the salmon screwing up any kind of lake system or other population by overpopulating a lake or a drainage, because they don't return and spawn. They just return, get caught, eaten, or sold. It's a great thing, actually. And so, of course, these populations of sockeye do stray. All populations of salmon stray to one degree or another. But the beautiful thing about it is that, the majority of them, if not all of them, will be caught because they're there to be caught and eaten. So, now the downside to the commercial and subsistence scene is actually what's left behind by the fishermen. The Russian River in particular is a huge hotspot for tourists and residents to go down, whether or not they need it to survive, just putting that out there, and catch their sockeye salmon. Now, all of the people in that area causing bank erosion is a bad thing, because it removes possible spawning sites, as well as it might create them for future returning runs of salmon, as well as other fish. And then on top of that, all of the lead from them flipping and flossing, which I'll get to that in a second, just gets a great portion of it just gets left to those drainages, contributing to the wonderful future Kenai Peninsula lead mine, and poisons. Albeit it doesn't do it to a large degree in the freshwater, but all of that lead eventually washes into the ocean. Just slowly but surely. It's terrible. And this is why I'm a big advocate of creating a mandate to use tungsten, because it's not toxic, instead of lead. But whatever is cheaper and more available, humans are going to use, whether or not it's good for the environment. Uh, so, and then on a personal note, I hate the practice because I'm a fly fisherman, but in my heart, I am a fly fisherman. And seeing a fly rod used in the manner of which flossing and flipping is disgusting to me, because fly rods aren't meant to do that. And fly fishing is centered around getting the fish to willingly bite your fly. And you're just lining a fish in the mouth, just snagging it in the mouth. Uh, it's a terrible, terrible practice. I wouldn't want to, personally, I wouldn't want to eliminate it completely, because without it, it's just going to do more harm than it would good, arguably. But it needs to be contained or more regulated because of the environmental impact it has as far as water quality and fish populations, as well as fish health. The reason I say fish health is because a great deal of people who go flossing and flipping end up snagging more fish and having to release them than they do actually snagging a fish in the mouth and then getting it up on shore. Now, let me tell you something that this, I'm sure, happens more often than you'd think. But once a fish, or hypothetical red salmon, goes up, it gets snagged in the belly, it has a good inch by inch gash torn into the belly of that fish, water gets in its gut cavity, it can water harden the eggs before the fish is ready. And this is a study that needs to be done more, I believe, but it needs to be checked out because I'm sure this happens a lot, and destroys fish stocks more than it needs to. This is why I'm a big fan of using barbless hooks for the practice of flossing and flipping, because you'll just damage a fish less, and it's far easier to get a snagged fish off with a barbless hook without even having to touch the fish than it is with a, barbed hook. But anyways, there's a gash now torn in the belly of this fish. Water gets into the gut cavity of this fish, and so the eggs are now water hardened and cannot be fertilized. But it still goes to spawn, and now it's just wasted all the energy of a fertile fish spawning with an infertile fish. So you just wasted X amount of eggs, sperm, and spawning space for these fish. And this happens, I'm sure, way more than you think. Again, there needs to be a wider study on this sort of thing, as well as, there just needs to be a wider study. But this is why I'm a big advocate for making sure flossing gets regulated properly, because if not regulated properly, at least looked into as far as environmental impacts and fish health, because of this possible occurrence, which again, I'm very sure happens a lot more than you'd think. It also ruins the fishing experience for people who want to catch fish properly. And what I mean by that is so like on the Russian River, you want to go for trout, on a, when for whatever time of the year, you're going for trout, you're in an area where nobody fishes for sockeye, but then somebody ends up going there, spooks all of the fish because now they're flossing and flipping, so you have to constantly move because of that. And if you do move, the fish are probably spooked anyways at this point. And then another problem I have with flossing, the people who typically floss are the main culprits of not having proper fish identification skills. So they end up keeping trout and char, the occasional whitefish, just everything. And it's terrible. If they don't do that, now they've needlessly damaged the fish itself. It's a terrible thing. The practice is awful, and it just needs to change, to simply put it. Yeah, that's all I really have to say on it. There's not in the form of when it comes to subsistence fishing for sockeye, there's not a whole lot of good that really comes from it, except like I was talking about with earlier with commercial fishing, um, keeping populations at a good equilibrium to not cause crashes of planktonic food sources in lake systems. Anyways, so flossing culture needs to change because that is the number one way people fish for sockeye in the state, and it's now so embedded in the culture. And I'd argue that the take or subsistence culture partly came, at least today in today's world, partly came from flossing. And anyone who says you can't get sockeye salmon to bite has probably never even tried. Because I tie these shrimp flies that imitate what they like to eat in the ocean, and I have absolutely no problem catching sockeye salmon in freshwater fly fishing for them, getting them to willingly bite. But people are so lazy, they don't want to put in the time and effort to actually get sockeye salmon to bite. It's really unfortunate how lazy people are about this. And for the record, I have gone flossing. I have done it. I don't like it. So I'm not talking from just, I watched it. I've actually practiced it and know a lot of the ins and outs of how it works and the kinds of people that do it. Um, yeah. The bottom line is flossing and flipping needs to change. And with either a small step like switching it to using barbless hooks only, or the other thing, having tungsten weights instead of lead weights mandated, or even again, I don't think it should be eradicated completely. It just needs to change. Or, for one thing, have the practice mandated only for sockeye salmon. Because I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody go put holes in king salmon that they just end up releasing back anyways by flossing, when king salmon are easily caught, or not easily, but caught just like any other salmon, um, by flies, roe bait, trolling, spinning glows. You know, the main way you catch king salmon is by getting them to bite, whether or not they want to feed on whatever you're providing them or giving them an opportunity to feed on, or they're biting out of aggression because they moved up into fresh water and they're all hyped up and fighting for mates and they want to attack everything that gets near them. Uh, by the way, it is a major misconception that fish get angry at like flies. The reason salmon flies are typically flamboyant in their colors is just like is the same reason salmon get their spawning colors, because it's like war paint, like challenging other mates for the right to mate or find prime spawning grounds. So that's why salmon bite most of the time on lures and bait in fresh water, because it's from competition, the willingness to fight for the right for spawning grounds or mating. So there you go. They're not pissed off. They're just aggressive because it's time to get it on, you know? It's just like if you were on a date and somebody was hitting on your date, you want to punch that person in the face. So there you go. I just explained it for you. Um, yeah, flossing is a terrible practice, but it can be better. And I don't believe it should be outlawed at all. But it needs to change, either through, like I stated before. And I would even argue that it needs to be specifically only for catching red salmon, so you're not damaging other species of fish throughout a longer time of the season of fishing. So, I'm going to call it the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. Please, I actually would love to hear any comments you have on this, actually, especially changing the fishing culture around flipping and flossing for sockeye. So please leave a comment below, subscribe and like and share. And I will have the next episode out very soon, and it will be on probably my favorite of all the salmon, the king salmon. So thank you for listening, and have a good day.